some of the muscles we talked about last time. You have the, wrong button here. Obliquus capitis superior muscle. It's highlighted in blue there. You have the rectus capitis posterior major and the rectus capitis posterior minor above that. So there's the minor and there's the major. You have the obliquus capitis inferior muscle. Hit the wrong button here. Okay. Again, that's the inferior. That's the superior. You have the levator scapulae, which is a big muscle on the side of the neck. The supraspinosus ligaments, which extend down the spine. The dorsal rami, which are the extensions of the spinal cord as the spinal nerves come in and out. Remember, you have a ventral root and a dorsal root. Okay, the ventral root, the dorsal roots are sensory, information coming in. The ventral roots are motor, information going out. And the rami is just the combination of those nerves as it travels away from the body. And you have the transverso spinae muscle, again, that runs both sides of the spinal column. So we'll go over a couple of the muscles here we talked about last time. Okay, foramen magnum literally means big hole. That's the big hole in the skull where the spinal cord exits. You can see the spinal cord coming through there. The oblique capitis superior muscle again, up on the sides of the skull. The dorsal rami, you get a little deeper dissection. You can see the dorsal rami as extend from the spinal cord. Remember, the spinal cord is encased by 3 layers of meninges for protection. The dura mater, arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. The dura mater is the thick, hard outer meninges. And there's your dura mater that surrounds the entire spinal cord and surrounds the brain. It's all continuous. And again, the levator scapulae muscles from this big muscle on the side of the neck. Okay, a little deeper dissection. You still see the foramen magnum. Still see the opening right there where the spinal cord comes out of. And this one, they've taken the dura mater and they reflected it away. So you can both sides of the dura mater open up so you can see the arachnoid matter underneath. And again, the levator scapulae muscle. The dura mater has been reflected, so it's been pushed to the sides. You see how the spinal cord is a little more open now. Still the dorsal rami coming out from the spinal cord for their spinal nerve. The superior auricular process of the sacrum. Remember, the sacrum is just below L5. L5 has the inferior articular process. The sacrum has a superior articular process. That's where the bones meet that line up your vertebrae. You have the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, so there's your dorsal root. And the ganglia is a swelling on those nerves that exit. The swelling is just an accumulation of cell bodies. That's what a ganglia is. It's an accumulation of nerve cell bodies. And you can see the arachnoid matter that's covering over the spinal cord now, since the dura mater has been reflected. If reflected the arachnoid matter, you would see the pia mater. So the pia mater is very hard to see because it's very thin. It's like transparent. Okay. And coming out from the spinal cord, you have your cervical enlargement. It's just the swelling of the spinal cord in the cervical area. You have a surgical enlargement and a lumbar enlargement. There's your spinal cord coming down. There's a lumbar enlargement, just like the cervical enlargement. You have the conus medullaris. The conus medullaris is the end of the spinal cord. That's where the spinal cord ends. Okay. The nerves continue down, but the spinal cord itself ends at the conus medullaris, right around L4, L5. Okay. The quadrata equina, or L1, I'm sorry, L1, L2 is when the conus medullaris ends. The cauda equina is the lumbar L2 to L5, where the nerves exit from those and form a grouping. That's your cauda equina. And your filum terminale is the very end where the pia mater extends out. It's a kind of like a extension of the pia mater that ends all the cerebrospinal fluid that protects it all the way up. Okay, so that's your conus medullaris, which is the end. Cauda equina, which is L2 to L5, the nerves. and the film terminality is the extension of the pia mater that helps support the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, a little bit closer up. Again, we still have the rectus capitis posterior minor, rectus capitis posterior major, right below that. The oblique capitis superior muscle to the side, and the oblique capitis inferior muscle below that. And we got the spinal process of the axis. Remember, the axis is, what's the axis? What number of vertebrae is the axis?
C2.
C2, perfect. Axis is C2. The atlas is C1. So that's a spinous process which points out posteriorly. So that's a spinous process of the axis, C2. Semispinalis of cervical muscles extend down from the top of the neck down into the spinal cord. Okay, the spinous process. Okay. Those are all the processes of the spine. It goes down the spinal cord. Levator muscles is big, thick muscle right here for the neck, side of the neck. And the posterior tubercle of the atlas also is right. You can see right there. Okay, so there's your posterior tubercle of the atlas, and there's your spinous process. You have it just below it. Okay, a little bit deeper dissection. Again, the foramen magnum you see real clear. You see the vertebral artery as it branches out from there and goes down the vertebral column. You have the dura mater, protects the spinal cord. And again, the levator scapular muscles, these big, thick muscles on the side of the neck. Okay. Again, foramen magnum, levator scapular muscles, and the arachnoid matter, because the dura mater has been reflected. You can see that where this dura mater, you can see where it points in. It's been cut down the middle and then pulled open. So it's laid to the side. So here's your dura mater reflector, and underneath that, you can see the arachnoid matter, which covers the spinal cord and the dorsal roots to help protect them. Okay. Little deeper dissection, foramen magnum. And up there, you see the tip, a little corner right here of the cerebellum. Remember, that's the hindbrain. You just see a little bit of that blue area right there. That's the cerebellum, just a little peak corner of it. You have your dorsal root ganglia. Again, those are your dorsal roots of the dorsal rami. Okay, but there's the swelling. The swelling is the ganglia. That's where the nerve cell bodies are, the somas. Okay, that's what causes the ganglia. You get your dorsal roots. When your dorsal roots are sensory roots, they have information coming into the central nervous system. Okay, your ventral roots are your motor roots, because each information going out to the motors for muscle contraction. There's your spinal cord down the center, dorsal rami again, the vertebral artery, and the medulla oblongata. Remember, the medulla oblongata is the base of the brainstem. Okay? That's where the spinal cord originates from. That's your base of your brainstem. The supraspinosus ligaments, again, run down the spinal cord. Okay? Those are the ligaments that are reinforced between each vertebrae. The levator costarum muscles, okay, between each vertebrae as it goes down. The semispinalis thoracic muscles goes down the spinal cord. And again, you can see the dorsal rami, these roots that are coming out right here, these nerves. Okay, that's your dorsal rami. Again, you got the dura mater, protects the spinal cord. Levator costarum muscle, again, that goes in between each vertebrae. And the dorsal rami. You see them coming out multiple areas. That's your spinal nerve, your afferent portion of the spinal nerve. Okay, again, the dura mater has been reflected. So you can go to the side. So in the middle, now you see the arachnoid matter. So you see the arachnoid a little bit thinner. You can see down into the spinal cord. And again, here you can see the dorsal rami really well. Nerves look like kite string. They're white, they're fibrous, and they just extend out through there. You can see those little white tendons that are sticking out. That's your dorsal rami. And when they swell at those areas, those are your dorsal ganglia. And the root is the one that comes right off the spinal cord. Okay, so here's your dorsal roots. It means it comes right off the spinal cord. Okay, the dorsal root ganglia are the swellings that you see of the cell bodies right there. And the dorsal rami extend from the dorsal root ganglia, and they extend down. Okay, so you got your dorsal roots coming directly off the spinal cord. They form a ganglia. The ganglia is where the nerve cell bodies are. There's synapses in there. The neuron synapse, as those nerves come out of the ganglia, they form the dorsal rami. Okay, so you have your dorsal roots, your dorsal root ganglia, synapses with the swelling of the nerve bodies, and then the dorsal rami as it comes out. Again, you see the dorsal rami as they come out, like little string-like structures. Multifidus muscle, again, runs the length of the spinal cord, and top of the spinal cord runs the supraspinosus ligaments that connect all the vertebrae together. Those are your ligaments. And this is lower down in the lumbar region. So we'll go take the dissection a little deeper here. Again, dorsal rami. When you see the rami, the dorsal rami come right off the spinal cord. Then they swell up. You can see right down here, like this little swelling right there where the pointer is. Oh, you get that off of there. See right there, that little swelling? That's the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, then coming off that would be the dorsal rami. Little sections right there. And then the dura mater over the spinal cord. Okay, coneus medullaris. What's the coneus medullaris? The end of the spinal cord. That's where it ends. Now the nerves continue after that and branch down. That's the ending of the physical spinal cord, is a conus medullaris. The dura mater is pulled back again. So you can see the arachnoid matter and the spinal cord underneath it. And again, you can see the dorsal rami, the little nerves which look like little strings coming off of there. Okay. Again, the cona medullaris is that tip right there. There's your end of your spinal cord. Dorsal rami coming off. The cauda equina. The cauda equina is a group of nerves that come off from L2 to L5. And it's called the cauda equina after the end of the spinal cord. The filum terminale. Filum terminale is the extension of the pia mater that forms a sac around that area so the cerebrospinal fluid can flow down there. So the cerebrospinal fluid flows in there and it protects that area. And that's where cerebrospinal fluid enters back into the venous system. So the cerebrospinal is constantly being produced, constantly being eliminated. So it's constantly being replaced. It's not stagnant. Cerebrospinal fluid doesn't always exist. It exits in the venous system and it's produced up in the cordoplexus up in by the lateral ventricles. I'll think of the word in a second. And the dorsal root ganglia, you can see the swellings. Remember, whenever you see the word ganglia, you know it's a swelling with the nerve branches. The choroid plexus, that's what I'm trying to think of. Sorry. Choroid plexus is up by the ventricles where that produces the cerebrospinal fluid. So it's produced in the choroid plexus and it exits in the filum terminale. Okay, down deep, this is the sacral region. You can see the supraspinosus ligaments, again, between the spinal cords, between each vertebrae. The gluteus maximus, which is the main muscle of your buttocks. The multifidus muscle extends on the sides of the spinal cord as it comes down. And the gluteus medius is one of the minor muscles in buttock area. So your gluteus maximus is inferior, gluteus medius is superior to it. Cutting through those layers, you go into the dura mater, which you all know now is a protective matter over the spinal cord. The superior articular process of the sacrum. Here's the sacrum. So that's the tip of the bones that are going to articulate with the inferior process of L5. Remember how you have the superior, and in between those you have the cartilaginous pads. Okay, so you have the superior articular process of the sacrum, and that's going to articulate with the inferior articular process of L5. And again, you can see the gluteus maximus muscle here, and gluteus medius superior to it. Okay, again, the dura mater is pulled back, so now you can see the arachnoid matter. And again, the superior articular process of the sacrum, you can see a little bit better, a little more clear. See the ends of the processes there. Then the filum terminale. This is where the pia mater, this forms an extension, and where the cerebrospinal fluid is returned back to the venous system. Okay. Again, you'll see that this is the spinal cord, the sacral region, at the very bottom here. And we see our dorsal rami as they extend out from the spinal cord. Okay, you have the dorsal root ganglion, and the dorsal rami that extend out. The cauda equina, okay, this is your extension of nerves, L2 to L5. Okay, that's just your grouping. It's a group of nerves like a plexus, but it's not, they don't really interlace, but it's just a grouping of nerves. It's your cauda equina, L2 to L5. Superior pocket, film terminality again, where the cerebral spine goes back to the venous system, and it's an extension of the pia mater. And this is the subarachnoid space. Okay, this is the arachnoid's been moved, and you can see below the arachnoids. Subarachnoid space is between the arachnoid layer and the pia mater. That's the layer where the cerebral spinal fluid exists. Below the arachnoid, above the pia. Okay. And looking at the brain, we talked about the cerebral hemispheres. Remember, the pia mater covers it, and you really can't see the pia mater. It covers over it, and it's like a saran wrap. It's like taking saran wrap and folding it over the brain. It's really thin, transparent. And it's a very thin protective layer. The central sulcus is the groove in the brain. Okay? In front of that groove, you have the precentral gyrus. Behind you have the postcentral gyrus, okay, which we'll talk about in a second. That's your central sulcus right there. Sulcus just is a small fissure, not as deep. A fissure is a deep sulcus. There's no magical number. It's just as you compare between the two. Yeah, the parietal occipital sulcus is between parietal lobe and your occipital lobe right here. Okay, that's the sulcus that divides your parietal lobe and your occipital lobe. Remember, the occipital lobe's in the back. Parietal lobe bone is up on the top on the side. You have your arachnoid villi. Okay, you have the arachnoid mater, which is covering here, because here the pia mater has been removed on the left side. On the right side that you're looking at has the arachnoid mater, which is thicker, and you can see it. And that groove between the two hemispheres of the brain is called the longitudinal fissure. I think we covered that in class already too. So here you have a frontal lobe. You have the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. Okay, remember the central groove there, central sulcus. You have the parietal lobe and you have the occipital lobe of the brain. Just it corresponds to the same bones that we've learned. The only thing different, we have a central sulcus, and anterior to that, it's called the precentral gyrus. Gyruses are bumps, sulcuses are grooves. And behind the central sulcus, you have the postcentral gyrus. Your bumps or your gyruses there. Okay, looking at the side of it, a little easier to see the different types of lobes. Here's your frontal lobe, okay, where the frontal bone is. This is the central sulcus. That's it, one of the main grooves dividing the brain. In front of it is your precentral gyrus, this area right here. Distal to it or posterior to it is your postcentral gyrus. Then you got your parietal lobe. Okay. Then you got your occipital lobe. And you got your temporal lobe. Just like the bones of the skull, same areas. Okay. You have a parietal occipital sulcus, which is a groove between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. You have the cerebellum, which you can see as the hindbrain back there. You have a transverse fissure kind of across it between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. And you have a lateral sulcus, which divides basically the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. That's called the lateral sulcus. So far, so good. All right. Remember we talked about the insula. The insula is a deep part of the midbrain. We open up the top part of the cerebral cortex, just above the temporal lobe, and you can see the insula. The insula is the area of the brain that's responsible for hunger, taste, auditory, what else? Hearing. Okay, that's the area of the insula. And then you see your temporal lobe down here too. And that's where the insula is, just below the cerebral cortex. Looking underneath it here, Again, you see the frontal lobe. This is the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex where all your thinking takes place, all your cognitive thought process. Okay, you can see the pituitary gland that sticks out right from underneath there. Pituitary gland is we haven't learned about yet. We'll learn about all the hormones released from that. Okay, it's also called the hypophysis, is your pituitary gland. Distal to that, you have your mammillary bodies, which you talked about as part of we'll talk about the limbic system. You have the temporal lobe of the brain. You can see the spinal cord originating off the medulla oblongata. So here's your medulla oblongata. You have the inferior portion of the brainstem. The cerebrum, the cerebellum, responsible for your motion, coordinate your smooth actions. Okay, the pons, which is right across from the cerebellum, across from the medulla oblongata, is the pons. And then the infundibulum. Remember, the infundibulum is a stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. So when you have a brain, if we go back to class, you can dissect the brain, they don't have pituitary glands. The infundibulum is a stalk, and it extends into that bony sulca turcica of the sphenoid bone. So when you pull the brain out of the skull, the pituitary gland stays in there because the sulca turcica is like a cul-de-sac that surrounds it. Okay, surrounds it, almost completely surrounds it. So when it pulls out, the infundibulum snaps off. You get the pituitary gland snaps off the infundibulum. But the infundibulum connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. That allows all the information from the hypothalamus to go to the pituitary and control what hormones are released from the pituitary gland. And we will go over all those hormones. Okay? Looking at this, looking at the different nerves that come off of it. Remember, the cranial nerves do not enter the spinal cord. Cranial nerves all come off the cranium. Okay? These are your olfactory bulbs. These are bulbs that detect smell. Okay? In dogs, sheep, animals like that, those bulbs are a lot larger than ours. They can smell a lot better than we can. Okay? You have the olfactory tract, okay, which carries that information to the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve number 1. You have the optic nerve, which comes down, okay, and forms that chiasm that actually you can't see it right here in this. I have to go a little bit deeper the dissection. So the optic nerve is for sight. Then your oculomotor nerve, number 3, trochlear nerve, number 4, trigeminal nerve, number 5, abducen is 6, vestibulocochlear nerve is number 8. The facial nerve is number 7. And those are nerves you can see on that dissection right there. You also have the internal carotid artery, the posterior communicating artery. And this is going to form what's called a circle of Willis around the brain that feeds blood into the brain. These arteries right here. And the posterior cerebral artery. And below that, you have the basilar artery. And coming up from the bottom by the medulla oblongata is your vertebral artery. Remember, arteries bring blood away from the heart. Veins bring blood to the heart. We'll go over that when we go over the cardiovascular system. So all those arteries supply blood to the brain. All right, these are kind of hard dissections to visualize, but that opening there is the third ventricle. Remember, you have the first 2 ventricles on the side. What's the structure that separates the first and second lateral ventricles? Anybody remember?
Is it the cerebral aqueduct?
That's what connects the third and fourth. What separates them is the septum pellucidum. That separates them. Now, what connects them from the first and second ventricle to the third ventricle? That's the interventricular foramen that connects them. So that's where your third ventricle lies right there. Okay, you can see the thalamus, which is your egg-shaped nucleus right there, which is your major relay section of everything feeding up into the brain and then distributed to the cerebral cortex. The cerebral peduncles carry your nerve tracts through there. The folia, that's folds of your cerebellum. And then you got your cerebellar fissure, which divides it into different sections, posterior section and anterior section. Your inferior colliculus and your superior colliculus. What does the inferior colliculus do? Handles what? These are your quadrigemini, your superior colliculus and your inferior colliculus. The inferior colliculus handles auditory. The superior colliculus handles vision, your sight. And those are 4 bumps. Just when you separate the cerebellum and the cerebrum, you'll see 4 bumps there. Your quadrigemini, for quad for 4. The ones anterior are your superior colliculi for sight. The 2 bones posterior, you can see there are your inferior colliculi for auditory, for hearing. Okay, again, the side view of the same thing we're just looking at. You have the internal capsule. Here you have your inferior colliculus. You can't see the superior colliculus, I don't think. No, I can't see it. But you have your superior cerebral peduncles, where your nerve tracts connect to them. The cerebellum. This is the which is a nucleus that extends up below the cerebellum. You got your middle cerebellar peduncle. You got your cerebral peduncles. Okay, and here you got your pons. Remember, the pons sits just in front of the cerebellum, separated by the medulla oblongata. The pons is the that relay station there. Okay, and you got optic. These are your optic nerves and your tracts here. That's for cranial nerve number 2. Cranial number 2 is your optic nerve. You can see where it enters, where it exits the brain right there. Okay. Looking at the bottom piece of it, here you have a really good view of the optic chiasm. Optic chiasm is an X. You can see it right there. Okay, you can see this piece comes up. We'll get that off there. But you see the 2 lines coming up. Okay, this is your optic tract. This is the optic chiasm, and coming out is the optic nerve. So from the eye, you have the optic nerve that comes off the retina. Okay, goes into the optic chiasm. Chiasm is an X, where the right side goes to the left side goes to the right. And that becomes the optic tract after the chiasm. Okay, so you got your optic nerve, goes into the optic chiasm, when they switch sides into the optic tract. And you can see those really clear on this example right here. Okay, you have your pons, which is a swelling just above the medulla oblongata, just adjacent, right across from the cerebellum. You got your middle cerebellar peduncles. This is the cerebellum. This is medulla oblongata, the base of the brainstem. Decussation of the pyramids. Pyramids are your nerve tracts, okay, that run along the side of the spinal cord, up to the brainstem, sorry. Okay. Desiccation means what? Decussation is your second order neurons. That's where they cross over. When the right side goes to the left and left goes to the right, that's called decussation. That's your crossing of your nerves. Those are second order neurons that cross over. And there's all the nuclei again. These are the pyramids, more tracks coming up. The cerebral peduncles and the mammillary bodies. The mammillary bodies are really good here. They're really hard to, on dissections, mammillary bodies are really hard to find. But here you can see them just perfectly. Those are your mammillary bodies right there, just below the optic chiasm. And you see, look just above the mammillary body. See that little opening right here? My pointer's on it. What is that? Just behind the optic chiasm. That's the stalk or the infundibulum. That little opening right there. This is where the infundibulum extends. Infundibulum connects the hypothalamus with the pituitary gland. That's where the infundibulum comes out right there. Okay, more stuff's dissected away. Arbor vitae. Arbor vitae is part of the cerebellum, and arbor vitae is Latin for what? What do those things remind you of?
Tree of life.
Tree of life, perfect. Arbor vitae is your tree of life, like branches of the tree that innervate into the cerebellum. In the cerebellum, you have your superior cerebral peduncle. You can see those tracks there. The pons, which is one of that relay section right there. The inferior cerebral peduncle, the tracks coming up, and the middle cerebellar peduncle. So here's your inferior cerebellar peduncle, your middle cerebellar peduncle, and your superior cerebellar peduncles. All your nerve tracks feeding up into the cerebellum. Oops. All right, mid-sagittal section, side view. Okay, septum pellucidum, we'll start right here. Septum pellucidum is a separation between the first and second lateral ventricles. That's what separates them, is a septum pellucidum. You can see the cerebrum. Okay. You can see the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is one of the connections between the right and left hemispheres of the brain where nerve tracks run. So the corpus callosum is your connection between the right and left hemisphere of the brain. If you take the brain and open it up, you'll see it divides very easily. The corpus callosum is one of the ones that connect between the right and left side. You can see the falx cerebri, okay, which separates the sides of the cerebellum. You see the tentorium cerebri, okay, which separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. You can see the falx cerebelli, which separates the sides of the cerebellum. And then you have the cerebellum, spinal cord, as it branches down, the medulla oblongata, the beginning or the inferior border of the brainstem, and you can see the pons. The pons is that swelling. The easiest way to see the pons is locate the brainstem, which is always there, and look for the cerebellum, which is huge. And right across from the cerebellum is the pons. It's a swelling anterior to that, just separated by the medulla oblongata. You have your sphenoid sinuses we talked about before, your pituitary gland, which is a little real tiny gland, just you can see it right below the hypothalamus. There's your midbrain. Okay, remember the mid doesn't divide diencephalon, which is your thalamus, your epithalamus, and your hypothalamus. Okay, a lot of structures in there. Okay, a little bit blown up section. The basilar artery that feeds into the cerebrum. Okay. You see the mammillary bodies. Can't really see it that well. It's just a side view of it. But it's just behind the optic chiasm. So here's your optic chiasm right there. You see your optic nerve exiting right there. I mean, the chiasm is an X that crosses it over. You can see the thalamus, which is your egg-shaped nucleus, which is your main nucleus receiving input and motor output. The cerebrum coordinates everything into the thalamus. Where it goes, where it comes back into is through the thalamus. The singular gyrus means bump. Okay, with the brain, this is the singular gyrus. The corpus callosum connects the right and left hemispheres of the brain. The fornix is the most superior part of the limbic system. Okay. And you got the pineal gland. Pineal gland is right behind or posterior to the thalamus. What does the pineal gland do? Remember? The pineal gland controls circadian rhythm. It produces melatonin. Lets your body know when it's nighttime, when it's daytime. Okay. Corpora quadrigemini. Corpora quadrigemini are your superior colliculi and your inferior colliculi. They're four bumps. The two superior are your superior colliculi. The two inferior ones are your inferior colliculi. Superior colliculi is vision. Inferior colliculi is auditory. You can see the fourth ventricle just in front of the cerebellum. Okay. And what connects that to the third ventricle is the aqueduct of the midbrain. Okay, the mid-sagittal brain. Let's start with, let's go with the pineal gland. Remember, the pineal gland is connected to the hypothalamus by the infundibulum. So it's just below the hypothalamus, which is just below the thalamus. You can see the inferior colliculi. Okay, and you can see the superior colliculi in front of it. So there's your superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. Superior colliculi is for what?
Optic.
Optic. Inferior colliculi is
Auditory.
auditory. Perfect. Okay. Tentorium cerebelli, okay, separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. You see your cerebellum. The falx cerebelli separates the hemispheres of the cerebellum. Medulla oblongata is the base of your brainstem, where it starts. There's your pons. You're swelling directly across from the cerebellum, okay, separated by the medulla oblongata. The hypothalamus sits just below your thalamus. There's your thalamus, the H-shaped structure right there. You have your thalamus. Just where the thalamus is the epithalamus, which is a thin membrane. And then below that is your hypothalamus. Corpus callosum. Corpus callosum connects the right and left sides of the hemispheres of the cerebral cortex. The falx cerebri separates the right and left sides of the cerebral cortex. And the pineal gland is what we started with, going around. Okay. Let's see, you have interthalamic adhesions, which is adhesion in the thalamus gland. You have the third ventricle, okay, that feeds into your fourth ventricle. The first two ventricles drain into the third ventricle drains into the fourth ventricle. Okay, the interventricular foramen connects the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle. The aqueduct of the midbrain connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. Fourth ventricle flows cerebrospinal fluid into the spinal cord down the brainstem. So there's your third ventricle. Corpora quadrimini make up the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. There's your transverse sinus, your straight sinus. There's the fourth ventricle, just anterior to the cerebellum. The cerebral aqueduct. Okay, cerebral aqueduct connects the fourth ventricle down. There's your mammillary bodies. Again, mammillary bodies are very hard to see. There's little bumps right across there, just below the thalamus, the hypothalamus, sorry. This is what hypothalamus, you have the mammillary bodies. The interventricular foramen connects the first 1 and 2 lateral ventricles to the third. Septum pellucidum separates first ventricle from the second ventricle. You can see the anterior cerebral artery, supplies blood flow to the brain, and the inferior sagittal sinus, which is the space in between just below the cerebral cortex. Okay. Again, the corpora quadrigemini. The corpora quadrigemini consists of 4 bulbs. The 2 inferior ones are the inferior colliculi for auditory. The 2 superior ones are the superior colliculi for vision. You have the pineal gland, which sits just distal or posterior to the thalamus. Okay, it's your circadian rhythm, produces melatonin. Okay. Do not get, a lot of students get melatonin and melanin confused. Okay, melanocytes are in the epidermis. They produce melanin, which controls skin coloring. Pineal gland sits in the brain, just distal to the thalamus, and it produces melatonin, which is your circadian rhythm that tells you the difference between night and day. There's your thalamus. Okay, the fornix is the top or anterior superior portion of the limbic system. Corpus callosum, anterior commissure is another connection between the right and left sides of the brain. There's a hypothalamus, and just below the hypothalamus, you can see the mammillary bodies. Okay, there's 2 of those, and here's the swelling right in front of the cerebellum between this is medulla oblongata here. This is your pons. So the medulla oblongata separates the cerebellum from the pons. Okay, the ventricular side, this is the left side. Let's again start with the septum pellucidum, which separates the right and left first and second ventricles. There's your third ventricle. This is one of the lateral ventricles on the left side. The interventricular foramen, that opening connects the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. The anterior cerebral artery provides blood flow to the brain. Interthalamic adhesions, which is a little outgrowth in the thalamus that sticks the 2 sides together in that H-shaped portion of the thalamus. The basilar artery that also provides blood flow to the brain. Choroid plexus. Choroid plexus is where your cerebrospinal fluid is produced. Fourth ventricle. Transverse sinus and your straight sinus again. Your openings there. Your cerebral aqueduct. Cerebral aqueduct. Okay, drains the fourth ventricle. Okay, from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. Okay. Sagittal section of the brain. Again, a lot of similar structures here. The corpus callosum, which is your connection again. Your internal capsule, which is your projection fibers. Projection fibers, you have articular fibers, projection fibers. Projection fibers are the long-range ones that extend within the cerebrum. The articulate fibers are the short ones that interconnect parts of the cerebrum. The putamen is one of the nuclei. There's your putamen. The corona radii, these are projection fibers also. You can see where they extend all across. The optic tract, so you have your optic nerve, optic chiasm, the optic tract feeds into the superior colliculi. There's a temporal lobe of the brain. The brain stem, okay, the inferior portion is the medulla oblongata. The cerebellum, occipital lobe of the brain. The interthalamic adhesion, this point that sticks out from the thalamus. The pineal gland, which is just distal to the thalamus. This is your cerebral cortex and your association fibers. Okay, those are your short interconnecting fibers. Your projection fibers are very long fibers. All right, looking at the anterior coronal view of the brain with the kind of transverse section. You can see the this is the right side, this is the left side. You can see the corpus callosum connects the right and left sides of the brain. The septum pellucidum is dividing the first and second ventricles. You can see the caudate nucleus, which is more mesial than the putamen nucleus. You can see the fornix. You can see the third ventricle. You can see the oculomotor nerve, the optic tract, okay, after the chiasm. That's the putamen nucleus. The globus pallidus is another nucleus there. Here's your thalamus and your lateral ventricles. Okay. White matter. White matter of the brain is what? White matter is the axons, the myelination. That's what you're seeing as your white matter, your layer around those. Okay, the gray matter is the rest of it. The gray matter is the cell bodies. Insula is a section in the midbrain, just below the cerebral cortex, just between the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. That is your gustatory, your taste center, your hearing center. Okay, but that portion of the brain. The lateral sulcus that you can see, lateral sulcus. The basilar artery still that supplies blood flow up into the cerebral cortex. Vertebral artery that comes up from the vertebral column. You see the cerebellum, see the pons, the cerebral peduncle. The cerebral peduncle, mammillary bodies. Okay, remember mammillary bodies are just below or just inferior to the hypothalamus. And the cerebral cortex of the frontal lobe. That's your gray matter. So the cerebral cortex is made of a gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is your cell bodies, your soma. Your white matter is your axons, your myelinated axons. Okay, look at that cross section. You can see the lateral ventricles right there. Those are your lateral ventricles. You can see the septum pellucidum, which separates the lateral ventricles, the caudate nucleus, the insula, the fornix, and the thalamus. You got your cerebral cortex, which is the entire area there. The splenium of corpus callosum, which is your connection to the right and left side. This is a posterior horn in your lateral ventricle because it extends across the entire brain. Remember, it has that big horn shape. Okay, so those are the posterior sections here. Choroid plexus. Okay, again, where your cerebral spinal fluid is produced. Lentiform nucleus. The anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. And the genu of the corpus callosum. And part of the corpus callosum. Okay. Transverse section again, going a little more deep, a little deeper down. You have the longitudinal fissure, which separates the right and left sides of the cerebrum. There's a part of the corpus callosum, the genu of the corpus callosum. This is part of your lateral ventricle, the anterior horn. The globus pallidus is one of the nuclei. Lateral sulcus. Sulcus is the groove. Splenum of the corpus callosum. It's part of the corpus callosum that's connecting the right and left hemispheres. And the posterior horn of the lateral ventricles. Again, the choroid plexus, up by the lateral ventricles. The thalamus. The insula. The putamen. And the caudate nucleus. All right, back of the skull. The superior sagittal sinus, where the vein runs. You can see the dura mater on this side right here that surrounds it all. Okay, then you see the cerebellum. You can see the transverse sinus. So your superior sagittal sinus across the middle, your transverse sinus to the side, and the confluence of the sinuses is where they combine, where they meet. Because we haven't gone over the cardiovascular system, but we will. And then you see the left cerebral hemisphere. And you see the dura mater has been removed because you can see the gyrus and the gyri and the sulci. But that's your venous supply. Remember, venous supply runs towards the heart, arterial supply runs away from the heart. That's the difference between arteries and veins that we're looking at. All right, mid-sagittal view. You can see the ear right here, the nose right here. It's kind of hard to orientate this one, but you have your pineal gland, which is just behind your thalamus. This is the thalamus. The transverse sinus, where the venous system runs behind the perpendicular to the body, standing up position. Tentorium cerebelli. Okay, separates the halves of the cerebellum. The straight sinus, for sinus drainage. Interthalamic adhesion again. Falx cerebri separates the right and left sides of the cerebrum. Superior sagittal sinus, that's draining the blood away from the brain. The inferior sagittal sinus, below that, again, draining blood away from the brain. You have your midbrain, you have the third ventricle, and you have the infundibulum. Remember, the infundibulum is that stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Oculomotor nerve, which you can see really well in this dissection right here. There's your oculomotor nerve, and your cranial nerve. Okay, last one on this one. Again, inferior sagittal sinus and your superior sagittal sinus, which runs above. Those are venous return of blood back to the heart from the brain. You have your straight sinus and your transverse sinus. Tentorium cerebelli, okay, separates the right and left sides of the cerebrum. The sigmoid sinus, sigmoid just means S-shaped, so it's a sinus that bends around. Okay, you have a sigmoid sinus, also a sigmoid colon, we do the digestive tract. And this refers to the shape. The internal carotid artery, which is bringing blood into the vein, into the brain. The oculomotor nerve, again, you can see coming through that area. The corpus callosum, and the falx cerebri, which separates the right and left sides of the cerebral hemispheres. All right. Everybody knows everything now, right? Let's take our quiz. Which structure is highlighted? What do we say?
Occipital lobe.
Perfect. Occipital lobe. Second one, which structure is highlighted? What runs along the sides of the, or actually I know it's hard to tell, but it's what's opened up and reflected so you can see underneath to the spinal cord.
Dura matter?
Perfect. That's the dura matter. It's hard to see on the picture there, but I'm sure that's what that's what they're showing. That's reflected. And what is that little thing right there just behind the thalamus?
Pineal gland?
Thalamus. What's that?
Is it pineal gland?
Pineal gland. You guys are actually listening when I talk, huh? What space is highlighted?
Lateral ventricle?
Yeah, that's the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Okay, here's the anterior horn right here. So those should be the posterior horns of the lateral ventricle. Okay. This is which spinous is highlighted? Okay, this is one of the venous regions. We haven't really done that yet in the lecture. But you have the inferior down here, and you have the superior up in here. So that would be your superior, and it goes across the sagittal sinus. Okay. And what's that structure right there?
Conus medullaris.
Conus medullaris, right? That's the end of the spinal cord. That's where the spinal cord actually ends. The cauda equina is what? What's the cauda equina? That's a collection of nerves coming off L2 to L5. It's that grouping of nerves as it comes off below the end of the spinal cord. And the filum terminale is the ending. Go ahead.
I was going to say that where the fluid flows.
Right, for the pia mater. It's the extension of the pia mater to the end where fluid flows out into the venous system. Perfect. 7. What cranial nerve is highlighted? Okay. It's hard to see, but it looks like, this is cut here to the optic chiasm. So it looks like the nerve feeding into the optic chiasm. What nerve would that be?
Optic nerve.
Optic nerve. That's what it looks like to me. It's kind of hard to tell. No, that's the oculomotor nerve. Still, it's hard to see in there. They dissected, but that one there is the oculomotor nerve. Like I said, I'll make sure everything's really clear. What structure is highlighted? And again, it looks like it's been reflected so you can see into the spinal cord.
The
Dura matter?
Yeah, the dura mater. Because it's been reflected. Yep. What structures are highlighted? Okay, those are the
ganglia.
Perfect. Dorsal root ganglia, those are the swellings. You have the dorsal root coming off, dorsal ganglia, and the dorsal rami coming off of that. So those are the ganglia. Again, they might not agree with me all the time, but we'll try the best we can. What structure is that?
Pons?
Yeah, because you turn off the highlight, you can see that swelling right above the medulla oblongata. So pons. Which lobe of the cerebrum is highlighted? You got to look at what you're looking at and orientate yourself. Which lobe is that?
Frontal?
Yep. You can tell because you have the olfactory tracts right here. These are olfactory bulbs and olfactory tracts. That's your sense of smell. So this is the anterior portion. That's the anterior portion of the brain, which is your frontal lobe. Okay. What structure is highlighted there? That is really hard to see, but okay. Remember the septum pellucidum divides the lateral ventricle. So here's the septum pellucidum. Okay, your corpus callosum connects the halves of the brain. And then your fornix is your anterior part of your limbic system. So this looks like
forward plexus.
This is your lateral ventricle. This is the posterior horns of the lateral ventricle. And in the lateral ventricle, you have your choroid plexus, which produces your cerebral spinal fluid. So that should be the choroid plexus, which it is. I may not always agree with them. Okay. The highlighted sinus runs through which of the following structures? Okay, that's your venous return. That's your superior sagittal sinus. And it runs through I would say, well, anybody want to guess? So I would say I don't know what they're referring to, but this is the falx cerebri. This is the division between the right and left hemispheres. This is the extension of the arachnoid matter coming down. It forms these connective tissues. I would say it runs through the falx cerebri, but I guess it does. It's a weird wordy question because it runs through the top of the skull there. Okay, which structure is highlighted? A little dot right there.
Pineal gland.
It looks like it's, yeah, it looks like it's just distal to the thalamus. So the pineal gland. Very good. Okay, what muscles are highlighted? Big muscles of the neck. Can't miss them. With the two big muscles on the side of your neck in the very back. I'll give you a hint. They connect to the scapula. The scapula.
Levator scapulae.
Yep, you raise and let the scapula up. You see where they connect right to the scapula, right there, the end of it. Oops, didn't hit the right button. Still didn't hit the right button. There we go. All right, perfect. And this is the I don't know what they're looking at. Let me see. It looks like the dura has been removed, right? So this would be, I really can't tell if the dura and the arachnoid has been removed or just the dura. Anybody want to make a guess? I would say it's either the subarachnoid or the subdural. Maybe the subarachnoid. It looks like it's been both been removed. But that's just a guess. See if that, yep, subarachnoid. So the dura matter has been reflected and the arachnoid has been reflected. Now you can see the P matter, just the nerves running down. But it's really hard to tell. I wouldn't expect you guys to be able to tell that. All right. So what's this? Which right and left arteries branch from the terminal end of the highlighted vessel? We have not done the cardiovascular system yet. So what branches up into here? This would be your the vertebra comes up from down here, posterior communicating. Anybody want to take a guess?
The carotid?
The internal carotid. No, the posterior cerebral. Like I said, we haven't gone over that yet. I don't expect you to know that yet. Coming out there. I know the vertebra can't be the vertebra. The vertebral is down here that comes up, forms into the basilar, and the basilar comes up into the internal carotid. So this must be the posterior cerebral. Okay, when it branches into the sides of the cerebral cortex. Which sensory pathway is a highlighted structure to transmit touch sensations to the brain? Okay, so this is your spinal cord coming up. It says which sensory pathway in the spinal cord transmits touch sensations to the brain? Will be spinal thalamic, dorsal column medial lemniscal, spinal cerebellar, or anterior lateral? I know it has to go to the thalamus, right? That's where your relay center is. So I would say spinal thalamic. Nope. Dorsal columnar medial lemniscal. Dorsal? Yeah, dorsal is your sensory. Medial lemniscal coming up. So that one's your dorsal columnar medial lemniscal. Like I says, I wouldn't put that on the test. Okay, now this one, what is found in the highlighted structure? Okay, remember we have your superior sagittal sinus. This is the inferior sagittal sinus. What is in the inferior sagittal sinus? What does it do? We said they were venous structures. Veins carry what?
Blood.
Blood. Okay, perfect. Last one. What is the primary component of the highlighted structure? Okay, first of all, what is the structure pointing at? It's what connects the right and left sides of the hemispheres of the brain. So that is your corpus callosum. Okay, what's the corpus callosum made up of? Okay, they're extents that connect, allow communication between the right and left sides of the brain.
White matter,
Right? Perfect.
which would be myelinated axons.
It'll be myelinated axons. Perfect.